One. Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Brian A. Catlos, who has written Kingdom of Faith, A New History of Islamic Spain, which we are going to discuss today. And I usually ask my guests, what is it about Islamic Spain that brought you into your fascination about this topic?
Well, that's a good question. I guess, I was always interested, for a long time, I've been interested in the way people conceive of their identity, both as individuals and as communities. So for me, studying Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages is a really good way to get into that and to think about how people think of community and how that informs the choices they make in regards to, for example, political agendas, economic activities, how that informs the evolution of culture, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that for a number of reasons, medieval Spain, both Islamic and Christian Spain, is really an excellent kind of laboratory or environment to study these sorts of issues that have to do with identity and particularly religious identity in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. Now, before going to the Islamic conquest itself, I want to talk a little bit about Spain from, say, during the time of the rise of the Umayyad. And I know historians kind of have started to dismiss the term the Dark Ages, but I think it would be fair to kind of apply the term Dark Age for Spain or Hispania if you were going to use a more historical term for the Spain before the Umayyad conquest.
Well, certainly. I mean, this was a period. So if we look at Western Europe in the time of late antiquity, say from the 5th century forward, we're looking at a period when Roman imperial power in the Western Empire disintegrated, and the empire was infiltrated and transformed by migrations of barbarians who assumed power there. And this was accompanied by economic contraction, demographic contraction, a sort of diminution of urban life, certainly of learning, of communication. So, although historians, we may not like the term Dark Ages, certainly one could argue that in the former Western Roman Empire, the sixth, seventh, and eighth centuries were not necessarily particularly bright. So there is something there.
And the same goes, for example, to the England, Britain, before the Anglo-Saxon invasion, for example. You can clearly see similarities between Spain and Anglo-Saxon world at this time before the Umayyad conquest. But let's get into the rise of the Umayyad and, of course, the eventual conquest of Spain. So I want to give a little bit, if you don't mind, a background on the rise of the Umayyad as well, Umayyad Caliphate, before, we go into the conquest of Spain as well.
Sure. So, we have to look at the situation, as I said, in the world of late antiquity
Mm.
in the sixth and seventh centuries, which was that the two great empires of the time, the Roman Empire, which by now had its capital in Constantinople, and the Persian Empire, were both in a situation of
Mm.
crisis. A crisis which was, we might say, multifaceted, a crisis of politics, of economics, a crisis of climate, and it sort of culminated in a massive war between the Roman and Persian empires
Yeah.
in the late 500s. And, for centuries, Rome and Persia had been traditional enemies. And it was kind of like a situation like, say, the Cold War in the 20th century, where there were two great powers, the US and the Soviet Union, who were kind of positioned against each other, but very rarely engaged directly with each other militarily. They tended to fight through proxies and so on and so forth. And for both the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, this meant taking advantage of the so-called barbarian peoples on their periphery in order to strike at each other. Now, what happened was in the late 500s, Persia decided to invade Rome kind of decisively. And the Persians invaded in the late 500s. They occupied, large territories of the Roman Empire, particularly the areas that now we call the Middle East. And it looked like the Roman Empire was about to be defeated when the Emperor Heraclius, shortly after the year 600, managed to turn things around and ended up conquering the Persian Empire. So we had a situation where the two empires, the two hegemons of that world, suddenly collapsed. And this provided an opportunity for these barbarian peoples who were on the periphery of these empires and who had been engaging with them and infiltrating them and sort of acculturating to them over the previous centuries in order to gain a sort of historical protagonism. And this
Mm,
is what happens with the Arabs and Islam, right? This
mm,
collapse of these two empires coincides with the lifetime of Muhammad.
yep,
Muhammad provides the pagan Arabs with a sort of religious and cultural and political framework, which enables them to sort of stop being so barbaric, as it were, and to expand in a sort of in an effective way into the lands of what had been the Persian and what was the Roman Empire. And so very quickly we have this process where the Arab Muslim armies
mm,
conquer the Persian Empire and much of the Roman Empire.
mm,
In the aftermath of that, the Arabs establish the Umayyad Caliphate, which is based at Damascus and is very much a caliphate that looks towards Rome, both as a model and as an objective to conquer and overthrow.
mm. So when did they start expanding westwards towards, what is, eventually will and take over Spain? So, they know they took over most of the Middle East, but what about the westward expansion and into Spain? What will become the Umayyad Spain?
Well, like nature, politics abhors a vacuum. And what we see through much of the Roman Empire is a sort of collapse or disintegration of Roman power. Now, this had already happened through much of the Western Roman Empire, which had fallen to different barbarian groups, Visigoths, Franks, Ostrogoths, and so on. In fact, about a century and a half earlier, one of these barbarian groups, the Vandals, after invading Roman Spain, had crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar and for a short time held power in Roman North Africa. So, Byzantine North Africa was already kind of falling apart. And so the Muslim Arabs were able to move into this vacuum and to try to take control of it. And so they began shortly after the conquest of Egypt. Egypt was conquered, and then they began to move westwards. But what they found was that it wasn't such easy going. The
Yeah.
Arabs managed to conquer the Persian Empire and the Roman Middle East in a question of decades. But the process of conquering North Africa would end up taking the better part of 50 or 60 years.
Mm. Now, one of the reasons for the success of the conquest is, of course, we have to discuss the use of Berber tribes in the conquest of Islamic Spain. So, when did they realize that maybe you should use these Berbers? I'm sorry if I say that wrong, but to help us conquer the rest of the Visigothic and Ostrogothic parts of the occupation of the North African parts, and of course, again, eventually get into Spain.
Well, by the time that the Arabs arrived at North Africa, the Vandals had already been thrown out, and ostensibly, much of North Africa had returned, at least nominally, to Byzantine power, right? Of
Yeah.
course, what had happened was that there was a resurgence also of these local indigenous groups, these Berbers, who were able to assert their independence. And this is who the Muslim armies encountered as they moved westwards across North Africa. So we have to remember that Islam, as it was expanding, as the Arabs were expanding, they adopted an approach to governing and incorporating religious minorities in their new kingdom that they adopted from the Persians. And basically, the sort of rule of thumb was, and this goes back to the Quran and to the revelation of Muhammad himself, is that whereas Islam is obviously the correct religion, Christianity and Judaism are also acceptable religions in the sense that they venerate the same
Mm.
God as Islam, the same prophetic tradition. They are also religions which are centered on the God of Abraham, but they're incorrect. So Christians and Jews could be incorporated into this new Islamic political system as legitimate but secondary subjects, as it were.
Yeah.
Now, the problem was that many of these Berbers, some had adopted Christianity, some had adopted Judaism, but the overwhelming majority of these Berbers were pagan. And the approach of Islam to paganism was much like that of Christianity, in that it was absolutely prohibited. So you could not make any deals with pagans. So, as what had been the case in pagan Arabia, when the Muslim armies encountered pagan Berbers, basically the choice that they gave them was either to convert to Islam or to be fought until the death. And it was sort of a 50-50 proposition. Some of these Berber nations ended up converting to Islam, at least, ostensibly or superficially at first, and being incorporated into the new Muslim polity. And in this case, they were absorbed into or became part of the Muslim army. Others instead decided to fight. So the point being that by the time that the Arab armies made it all the way across North Africa and reached, the end of Morocco, as it were, there were actually very few Arabs in the army. And the army was made up overwhelmingly of indigenous Berbers who had at least ostensibly converted to Islam.
Mm. So let's talk about the conquest itself and how easy was this conquest because we talked about this in the our previous episode with the Roman Republic, how the Romans, for example, would use almost 100 years to conquer Spain when they tried to conquer, and we see this again in the Spanish Civil War, for example, how difficult terrain Spain has, to be able to decide of it decisive victory. And again with Napoleon, etc., etc. Spain is a difficult country or terrain, Hispania, to conquer. So how easy was this for the Arabs, say, compared to the Romans, for example, when they conquered Spain during the Roman Empire Republic era?
Well, the conquest itself was surprisingly quick and easy. And to understand why, we have to go back to the circumstances leading up to the conquest, and particularly the circumstances in Spain itself. So Spain was ruled over by Germanic barbarians called the Visigoths, who had about a century or so earlier converted to Catholic Christianity. And the problem was that the Visigothic elite itself was not united. There was a contest for leadership, and the king at the time, Roderick, was not recognized necessarily as the legitimate king by many of the Visigothic nobility. So the Visigoths themselves were divided, right? And so when the Arab-led armies showed up in northern Morocco and were preparing to probe the possibility of moving into Spain, right? They encountered elements from within the Visigothic elite who were dissatisfied with their own king. And they were able to make alliances with those elements in the Visigothic elite before or as the conquest was unfolding. So what happened was that when the Arab armies crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar, and how that actually happened is open to some question, given that the Arabs, at least the Arabs from the Hijaz, which is where Muhammad was from, did not have a seafaring tradition, right? So they didn't really
Yeah.
have boats. They must have had some local help in terms of getting over. And the sort of standard sort of narrative points to an individual named Julian, who seems to have been perhaps a Byzantine governor of North Africa, who actually helped them get across. Because Julian, being Byzantine, was no friend of the Visigoths and was happy to see the Visigothic kingdom undermined. So this Arab-led army crosses over to what's now Spain, and Roderick, who is the king, is busy in the north of the peninsula, trying to put down an insurrection there when he hears of this new invasion. So he rushes back to the south of Spain to do battle with them. It's actually a little bit reminiscent of what would happen in 1066 in England when
Mm.
Harold Godwin was fighting, Harold of Norway at Stamford Bridge when William the Conqueror arrived, and
Yeah.
and Harold Godwinson had to rush back down to the south of England to defend his kingdom. To cut a long story short, Roderick rushes down to the south of Spain. He does battle with this Muslim-led army made up largely of Berbers, and a good number of his own people defect to the Arab side. And this is what helps precipitate sort of a total disaster. Again, kind of like the Battle of Hastings, in which the king is killed and essentially the Visigothic army is decimated or all but decimated.
So,
After that,
yeah, no, go on. Yeah.
after that, Spain is basically defenseless. And so in Spain, the Arab armies are able to duplicate the same process of conquest which they used in the Middle East, which is that they would approach each town with their army, essentially, and they would give the town or the local leaders the choice of either surrendering or fighting. If they surrendered, they would be able to maintain their power locally, they would be able to practice their religion, etc., etc. They would just have to pay tribute to the Muslim Arabs. Whereas if they resisted, in theory, they would be conquered and they could all be enslaved and so on and so forth.
How
So as
many
you can
cities did
imagine,
actually resist the Arabs when they came and the Berbers? Were there any cities that resisted, or did most cities kind of surrender in
most cities,
immediately?
most most cities surrendered. There were a few that resisted and that were eventually conquered. But we have some interesting information about that because, for example, there's a famous document which is called the Treaty of Tudmir, which I dates from around the year 717, which is an agreement between Abdulaziz ibn Musa ibn Nasser, who was one of the sons of the first Umayyad governor of Al-Andalus. And this treaty is an agreement between him, the conqueror, and the local Visigothic lord of the area. And it's an interesting treaty because it's really a treaty which is not framed as a treaty of conquest, but a treaty of a transfer of allegiance, in which, on the one hand, the local Visigothic lord, Tudmir or Theodemir, promises to give a sort of annual tribute to the Muslims, and in return, the Muslims offer protection. So it was not couched necessarily as a sort of a violent submission, but rather a sort of realignment of who the executive power was in Spain. So for the Christians there, for the Visigoths there who survived, the option was basically carry on life as usual, but now you're going to be paying taxes instead of to the Visigothic king, you're going to be paying them to the Muslim Arabs.
Hmm. So we have to talk about the kind of elephant in the room right now, of course, which I'm talking about the conquest, a further expansion into Europe, and of course, eventually the Battle of Tours that would, according to Europeans, and we discussed this before, that while it's kind of, I'm going to say the Battle of Tours is overrated. I'm sure we will discuss this why later, but let's discuss the event, the kind of elephant in the room and how many probably some still think is this hugely important battle. Maybe it was for, so the Europeans at the time, but let's discuss what actually happened in Battle of Tours and perhaps some misconceptions around the Muslim expansion into Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. The Battle of Tours, which for those who don't remember, was a famous battle between Charles Martel and forces led by the Muslim governor of Al-Andalus. It took place in what's now northern France and was really one of the first sort of military defeats that the Muslims suffered in the West, as it were. And thanks in no small part to Edward Gibbon and his decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it took on a sort of mythical status in modern European historiography as a historical turning point where, had it not been for Charles Martel defeating this Muslim force, then Muslims would have conquered all of Northern Europe, and Europe, as we know, would not exist. So this is the mythology
Yeah,
that evolved around it. And that was a mythology that really served certain Europeans, particularly the sort of the French nation state, particularly well, as it sort of gave them a sort of stake in this epic history of civilizational conflict. Of course, nothing could be really further from the truth. What happened, in fact, was that the Muslims had no plan to conquer Europe. Europe as a concept didn't really exist at the time. And in any case, Northern Europe at that point was a poor, unhospitable, barbarian wasteland. What attracted more than anything the Muslims to attack Europe at the time was the fact that Europeans had a habit of depositing lots of gold and jewels and so on in their churches. And their churches were largely undefended. And so Muslim
kind of what the
raiders.
Vikings would do later.
Absolutely. It's exactly like the Vikings, right? Because they were out of the system, they weren't Christians. They didn't have to
Yeah,
respect the sanctity of churches, and therefore it was easy pickings for them. And so they followed this sort of trail up into Northern Europe as far as they could. Of course, they were by this time there were very few Arabs and even very few people in the army. You have to imagine that the army that crossed into
yeah,
Spain was already quite small, and having had to leave people behind to control the territory they had taken, by the time they were getting up to Northern Europe, they were very small forces indeed. And they couldn't really risk any attacks which were going to undermine their numbers or do them serious damage. So in some sense, it may be correct to say that, this defeat provoked a sort of retraction, as it
yeah.
were, a little bit of the Muslim forces, but it certainly wasn't seen at the time by either side,
Mm,
as an epic ground-changing event.
yeah. Now let's talk about, of course, I mean, have to move on a little as well. Let's talk about the Islamic Spain under Umayyad Caliphate rule from Cordoba up until, the escape from and the takeover of the fall of the Umayyad in North Africa. So let's talk about the period from the conquest until the fall of the Umayyad state in North Africa and the eventual what would become yeah, up until the escape of I don't remember his name, so that's right. But yeah, of the
Abd Al Rahman III, yeah.
Abd Al Rhamans, yeah. So let's talk about the Islamic Spain up until Abd Al Rhamans the third escape from Damascus.
Sure, we're talking about actually quite a short period because, the invasion was launched in the year 711,
Mm,
and the Umayyads in Damascus have been overthrown by the year 750. But essentially, in this first period, what the Muslim conquerors of Spain had to do was, they didn't have the manpower to dominate the peninsula, so they could only rule with the collaboration and cooperation of the former Visigothic nobility and the former Roman Hispano-Roman elite. And so that's what they did. And members of this elite, some of whom converted to Islam, but not all of them, played important roles in the establishment of Arabo-Islamic dominance in the peninsula. At the same time, the Arabs had to contend with a sort of continuing or deepening problem they were having with their Berber forces. There was a lot of ethnic animosity between Arabs and Berbers. And even though the Berbers, who had converted to Islam and therefore were, in theory, equal members of this new egalitarian Islamic society that the Arabs had constructed,
yeah,
the Berbers were treated very badly by the Arabs.
And
And
if I may, if I may add something, I believe most converts, like you said, in theory, where they were supposed to be equal, and not up until really the second or third generation of Muslims from converted families would be looked upon as equal. They still had some in, I believe, Umayyad Spain, Umayyad Caliphate had to pay taxes as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and the Arabs were really sort of mistreating the Berbers of North Africa. They were
Yeah.
continuing to raid them and take them as slaves, even though they were Muslims, and so on and so forth. So in the 740s, there was a massive Berber revolt across North Africa and Al-Andalus. So really, it was the whole venture of Al-Andalus in the first 40 years was at the point of collapsing. There was a danger too that the Arabs who had moved over there would be absorbed into the Visigothic political system. So that was another issue. There were very few of them. So it was really, in terms of the ultimate survival of Al-Andalus, it was very fortunate that the Umayyad Caliphate fell. The
If I
Umayyad
may
Caliphate,
ask an alternative
yes.
question, what do you think would have happened if they had failed and that Spain would we would not get Abd Al Rhamans to escape to Spain and the Islamic Caliphate would have fallen within the first 40 years? What do you think would happen? Do you think I just would have went on like before, or do you think, what do you see
Well,
happening
we
there?
can we can see what happened by looking at what's now the south of France, because the south of France was also under Muslim rule for this period. But by the time we get to the end of the ninth century, by the time we get to the year 800, rather, the Arab Muslims have given up on the south of France, and the south of France kind of devolves into this collection of independent local lordships, and that's likely what would have happened to Al-Andalus had the Arabs not been able to hang on.
Mm. So let's talk about the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate and the escape of Abd to the Abbasid Caliphate, and talk about the escape of Abd al Rahman. And again, this is also an event that is shrouded in myths and legends and misconceptions. And I believe you state in the book as well, it may not have been as fantastical escape as history claims the event to be.
Well, it's always hard to get at the details of history, and history, when it's written, is often framed as a sort of
Yeah.
narrative. And so, details are added. Often they're made up. Sometimes, with the best intentions, sometimes with the worst intentions. But what certainly did
I
happen
mean, most
was
chroniclers who write history weren't even there at the events, right? So they had to, so speeches, for example, and everything, you had to be invented on the spot while they were writing in monasteries or wherever.
absolutely, absolutely. So we're always very distant from history itself, and we're always
Yeah.
going through several layers of mediation and interpretation and agendas. But what we can say did happen was that by the year 750, the Umayyads had been overthrown. They had been overthrown in a sort of a multifaceted revolution, as it were, that was in the end led by another Arab family, the Abbasids, who replaced them as the caliphs of Islam. The Abbasids were based in Persia. They established a capital at Baghdad, right? This became the
Yeah.
new center of the Muslim world. And as part of their civil war against the Umayyads, it was important for them, and this was kind of standard operating procedure at the time, to eliminate the entire family so that they would no longer constitute a danger to the Abbasids. And so, in the course of this revolution, the Abbasid forces systematically attacked and killed every single member of the Umayyad family that they could get their hands on. And one member escaped, a young prince, the grandson of a caliph. His name was Abd Al Rahman, and he escaped westwards. First, he went to Egypt, and he realized that he wasn't safe there because the Abbasid agents were going to find him. And then he went further west to what's now Tunisia, and he took refuge with the local governors there. But the local governor wasn't very happy to have him there, this guy who was from the Khalifa family and might want to make claims on his power. And so Abdul Rahman, and this goes back to what I was saying about the Berbers, Abdul Rahman took refuge with the people of his mother, who were Berbers living in the Rif Mountains. So he retreated up to the Rif Mountains and he holed up there for a few years. And he put out word to all of the remaining surviving Umayyad clients and allies scattered across the Abbasid world in hiding to come, right? And so they came westwards. And in 754, he crossed over with his forces from North Africa to Al-Andalus. And he declared himself to be the Prince of Al-Andalus, not the Caliph, just the Prince of
Yeah.
Al-Andalus. All right. And of course, the people there, the Arabs there, weren't happy to see him there. They didn't want someone ruling over them. So he had to embark on a sort of mini civil war against the other Arab Muslims there
Mm.
in order to assert his domination.
I believe that, one of the reasons he did not want to be called Caliph was, of course, because the Abbasid claimed that power. And at this time, we will talk about the three caliphates later, of course, but, at this time, it was normal to have more than one caliphate. And, he was worried that he would, piss off the Abbasid too much by calling himself a caliph. And, of course, it wouldn't be until a few more generations that they begin to call himself a caliphate. So I believe
Well,
that's one of the reasons.
yeah, I don't think he was really worried about making the Abbasids angry because, the Abbasids couldn't really do anything. They were
Mm.
too far away. But what he would risk is upsetting the local Muslim
Mm.
Arabs, right? And so it was important for him, even though, he was effectively a rebel, to continue to acknowledge the authority of the Caliph in Baghdad because there was a very firm idea among the Muslims that the Islamic world should be united and that there should be one community under one leadership. So it wasn't really necessary for him to challenge that because neither the Abbasids were not really in a position to do him any real harm, and he was certainly not in a position to do them any harm. So they kind of, came to a don't ask, don't tell sort of
Yeah.
arrangement. They kind of ignored each other.
Now, I want to take a little break from Abd Al Rahman, and I know you want to discuss this as well, because, and again, there's a lot of misconceptions coming up about this because there's still so many rumors and misconceptions about Islamic Spain, and one of them is, and in general about the Islamic world, is toleration. And we said this on the podcast before that while we think of toleration as acceptance of all religion, while it was true to a certain extent in that time, toleration did not mean the same toleration that we think about in the 21st century. So let's talk a little bit about toleration of the different faiths in Al-Andalus, and of course, talk a little bit about what really went on with it when it came to toleration and, of course, acceptance of other religions.
Sure, absolutely. So I think that toleration is sort of a I don't think it's a very useful concept because it doesn't really tell us much. When we talk about, one culture or one religion being supposedly tolerant or intolerant, it's a generalization which generally doesn't hold over time and in all places. People tolerate things, or people accept things, or people are tolerant of diversity and difference, largely when they see it as non-threatening and as a benefit to their own interests. Now, a couple of things happened in the Islamic world. First of all, as I mentioned, Islam comes out of the same religious tradition as Christianity and Judaism. In fact, Muslims saw themselves not as starting a new religion, but as returning to the religion of Abraham, the God of Abraham, which is the same faith of Christians and Jews, right? So they didn't see themselves as really being a different religion. The other thing is that the Muslim Arabs faced a challenge as they expanded into Persia and the Roman world, which is to say that they were nomadic barbarians, essentially. They had very little tradition, institutional tradition, and they didn't have the capacity or the manpower to to govern these complex empires that they had suddenly found themselves ruling over. And so the only way that they could effectively do that was by empowering the local people who were there and getting them to help them run this new empire, right? So they used a model of imperial culture, which they adopted from the Persians. And the Persians ruled over their empire as a collection of distinct communities, all of whom were kind of self-governing and who owed their allegiance to the Persian emperor. So these two things combined in Islam to produce the concept of dhimma, which is the protected people. So Christians and Jews who were members of the same basic religion as Muslims could become protected peoples, which is to say, they did not enjoy the full rights in society that Muslims enjoyed because they were not Muslims, right? But they occupied a status which was legitimate and which did entitle them to certain rights and duties. Rights to practice their own religion, duties to pay certain taxes, and within that framework, they were regarded as legitimate. And this was really the success of the Islamic expansion because it enabled the Arabs, who were very few in number, to extend over an enormous area, to incorporate that area into a sort of imperial structure, and then gradually the people of these territories, many of them, and eventually most of them, ended up converting to Islam. So it provided a bridge for the establishment of Islamic kingdoms and empires. Otherwise, the Arabs would have been just another barbarian group who disappeared, like the Vandals or the Visigoths.
Mm. So let's talk about the Umayyad rule under in of Spain until they fall, and later. And what would you call this a golden age for Spain? Perhaps the rule of Umayyads in during this time until they fall.
Well, every age is a golden age. It depends if you're the one that has the gold or not. Okay. So in terms of, a supposed golden age of Spain, what do we associate with the success of an empire or a country or a political system? We look for prosperity, we look for sophistication, we look for innovation, we look for hegemonic power, military power. And so certainly after a century or a century and a half in Spain, the Arabs, the Muslims now, arrived at the point where they were able to constitute a kingdom that embodied these sort of aspects of power that we tend to admire or consider to be successful. And Umayyad Spain, Umayyad al-Andalus, particularly once Abd al Rahman III declared himself to be Caliph of Islam in 929, truly became a sort of hegemonic, a world empire kind of thing. I don't mean worldwide, but on the world
Yeah.
stage.
So let's talk a little bit about how this global power function and how, I also, and we discussed this with in our episode of 101 with on Al-Andalus a few years ago, and how about cultural innovation translations, for example, of work. People came there to translate work of ancient histories and philosophies, etc. So let's talk a little bit about the innovation and culture, also agricultural innovations that happened during this era as well.
Sure. Well, you have to understand that in this era, and this was true across the sort of Abrahamic West or the Mediterranean world. It was true of Byzantium, it was true of the Abbasids, it was true uh, everywhere that people, rulers, saw knowledge as a key to power. And not only a key to power, but emblematic of power. There was an idea that knowledge in its own right had value, right? This is why the Persians, for example, began to assemble royal libraries that in theory contained all of the knowledge of the world because knowledge was power. Now, in order to cultivate a culture of knowledge and power, you need resources. You can't do it if you're poor. You can't pay scholars, you can't have laboratories, you can't have libraries, and so on and so forth. Now, what happened in Islamic Spain was that, until about the year 900, Islamic Spain was a rather poor place. It was not an advanced civilization, as it were. It wasn't a powerful empire. It was very tentative, always on the point of collapse. beset by invasions, rebellions, and internal tensions. But a couple of things happened around the year 900. And one of them was that Al-Andalus was able to uh, enter a period of stability thanks to the fact that a particular ruler, the Emir Abd Al Rhamans III, came to power, and he was able to systematically quelch the various rebellions that were happening in Al-Andalus. So he consolidated Al-Andalus politically and stabilized it, as it were, put his own people in charge of the various provinces so they would be dependable. The other thing that happened was that Al-Andalus became engaged increasingly with North Africa. And as it engaged with North Africa, it tapped into trade routes that crossed the Sahara from what's now Morocco down to West Africa, the area of the Niger River. The area around the Niger River is immensely rich in gold. There was a vast gold surplus there. And very quickly, Muslim traders were able to set up a system whereby they were bringing massive quantities of gold back to the Mediterranean from sub-Saharan Africa. It was that gold that came north that provided the Umayyads and Al-Andalus with the raw material in order to build this sort of cultural, scientific, and intellectual edifice. But one more thing had to happen for that to happen. While all of this was happening in Al-Andalus, over in the east, the Abbasid Caliphate, which had been very powerful and very successful, was coming apart. By the mid 800s, the Abbasid Caliphate was disintegrating. Now, in the meanwhile, the Abbasid Caliphate had become a cultural powerhouse. And the people who worked in culture there, the thinkers, the musicians, the theologians, the philosophers, and the scientists began to look for somewhere where they could work that would be more stable. So, as Al-Andalus became more rich, it attracted a migration of scholars, mostly Muslims, but also Jews, from the Abbasid world to Al-Andalus. And this, when these things came together, this is what produced that golden age in Al-Andalus. Political stability, money, and the ability to tap into an intellectual tradition and a cultural tradition that had already been created in the Abbasid East.
Mm. Now, how did they get scholars and no scientists and etc. into, because Baghdad was also at this time a powerhouse of knowledge, with the house of wisdom and science. So what's the competition between Umayyad Spain and Baghdad being the powerhouse of cultural knowledge and science?
Well, it's interesting because, when we get towards the year 900, the Andalusis, the people of Al-Andalus, are starting to feel like they're gaining some cultural chops, as it were.
Yeah.
And there was a particular scholar whose name was Ibn Abdrabi. And Ibn Abdrabi wrote this massive encyclopedia of knowledge, right? And he was so proud of it that he sent a copy of it to the court at Baghdad. And at Baghdad, they just laughed at it. And they said, there's nothing new here. All he's done is recycled everything that we've done and tried to pass it off as his
Hmm.
own. But what was happening at that time was that, as I said, the Abbasid world was coming apart. It was sinking into civil war. It was becoming unstable, violent, and there was less money to pay for scholarship. And so scholars began looking around. And it was at this very time that the caliphate in Cordoba could offer resources and money to scholars. So, it's difficult for us to consider, really. I mean, well, it's kind of like now, when a country wants to become powerful, what do they do? One of the things they do is they establish universities and they try to attract the smartest people they can. So China is constructing new universities and trying to get them to be, as sophisticated as they can. The Saudis and the Emiratis are constructing universities and trying to be as cosmopolitan as they can, right? And so the same thing happened in Al-Andalus. And the caliphate at this point had lots of money at its disposal because it was so rich, and it poured a lot of that money into patronizing culture and science, both because it was important on a tactical level, but also because it gave them prestige.
Mm. Now, I know we are running a little out of time, but I just want to talk a little bit about as well the time of the three caliphate and with the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate in the ninth, 10th century. So how did this, with three caliphates now, of course, as you said, Baghdad is, and the Abbasids are weakening in power, but still they had a lot of the respect, at least of the Sunnis. Now, the Fatimids would be a Shiite caliphate, of course, that would reign in, and of course, both the Umayyads and the Abbasids were Sunnis. So, but what was the friction between the three caliphates, and how did was there a balance or unbalance of the power dynamic in the Islamic world at this time with three caliphates now being in power?
Well, the idea, the fundamental idea, or one of the fundamental ideas in Islam is that the Islamic world should be united, right? Under a single
Yeah.
message and a single leader. And that was certainly true in the lifetime of Muhammad. But as soon as Muhammad passed away, the tensions within the Islamic community came to the fore, and there was disunion over not only who should succeed Muhammad as leader of the Islamic community, but what that community went and meant and how its political culture should be structured. And this is the origin of the split between the Sunnis and the Shias. Now, that split didn't really become formal, until decades later or even a century later, right? But there was an inherent division in the Islamic world. There were actually three branches of Islam: Sunnis, Shias, and Kharijis, who were kind of like fundamentalist anarchists who didn't believe in any kind of political power. So, the unity of the Islamic world was always, to a certain extent, an illusion, but a useful one. But as the Islamic world got larger and larger, and as the Islamic world became more Muslim, because more and more people converted to Islam, that central idea could no longer hold because it no longer reflected cultural or political realities, right? And
Mm.
so in the 8th century, in the 9th century, in the 800s, a group of Shia who were considered heretical by the Sunnis declared their own caliphate in North Africa. That challenged the notion of caliphal unity, right? Once that happened, once the Fatimids, as they were called, had established this Shia caliphate in North Africa, you had the Abbasids who had established a Sunni caliph, who had controlled the Sunni caliphate in Baghdad. What were the Umayyads going to do? The Umayyads' closest enemy was the Fatimids. So it was one, because of the Fatimid threat, and two, because now he was rich enough and powerful enough to do so, Abd Al Rhamans III declared himself to be the true Caliph of Islam. So really, it was a kind of a foregone conclusion that this split would happen. And it was the end of an era in the sense that it was the end of what had been a convenient political fiction.
Mm.
But I have to say this: the Fatimid Caliphate might have been Shia, the Abbasid Caliphate may have been Sunni ruled, the Umayyad Caliphate was Sunni, right? But nevertheless, they were inherently unified by a common belief in Islam, by a common religious culture, and by a common legal culture, which overrode those political differences. So even though these three caliphates were in theory enemies, there remained an incredible amount of movement and integration and exchange between them. Not the least because the Fatimid Caliphate, it might have been Shia, but the majority of the Muslims there were Sunni. In the Abbasid world, the Caliph might have been Sunni, but probably the majority of the Muslims there were Shia. And people just didn't ask any more than they needed to know because everyone wanted the system to work.
And I believe you could still travel around wherever you wanted. If you wanted to go to Baghdad from the Umayyad in Spain, you could do so. All you needed was a receipt. It was kind of like a European Union in a way that, you could travel everywhere in the Islamic world. Even, like you said, even if they were enemies, you could still travel from Umayyad Spain to Baghdad or to Cairo in Fatimid world.
Absolutely. And in fact, it was even better than the EU because you only needed to know one language.
Yeah,
So if you were a Muslim who spoke Arabic and you had what we might call a portable profession, you might be a merchant, you might be a scholar, you might be a man of religion, you could really find employment anywhere in that Islamic world that you went easily. So
yep,
it was a highly mobile world, highly mobile. You have to remember, in the 1300s, one single man, Ibn Battuta, a Muslim
yep.
from Morocco, traveled to China, to India, to Africa, to Europe, right? He was able to do that because he was doing it largely within this Islamic
World.
environment.
Yeah, yeah. And so in a way, the illusion of unity still existed, even with, the three caliphates being unsworn enemies. In a way, it was in a way you could say that them being enemies was sort of the real illusion, in a sense, because there was still some unity there.
In a way, yeah, the fundamental division for Muslims in the world was between Dar al-Islam, which is the world of Islam, and the world outside of Islam.
Yeah.
That's the difference. That's the key difference. Within the world of Islam, there were certainly ideological tensions, and sometimes these manifested themselves as civil wars and so on and so forth. But stronger than that was that inherent unity that held that culture together despite the political differences.
So let's talk about the fall of the Umayyads in Spain. And we talked about they had a golden, like what we would kind of to put a label on it, had a golden age. They had the scientists coming and cultural translations, etc., etc. So what would cause the eventual fall, and what would become a disunity in Islamic Spain for up until, and we will talk about this in a moment as well. So let's talk a little bit about the fall of the Umayyads in Spain.
Well, first of all, whenever you have an empire and you think you're having a golden age, it usually means you're about to
Mm,
fall, right?
yeah.
That's a general rule in history. So, on the surface, the caliphate in Al-Andalus was a highly functioning, sophisticated political entity. It was kind of like almost an absolutist monarchy, right? Except the monarch didn't have to do much. Because again, thanks to structures and strategies and institutions that had been imported from Abbasid Persia to Al-Andalus, right? It was, for its time, a highly regimented, bureaucratic, highly functioning government. Now, one of the problems was that the better that this machine of government functioned, the less the caliph had to do with governing. And while Abd Al Rhamman III was, a pretty hands-on guy in terms of government, right? His son, Al-Hakam II, wasn't. Al-Hakam II, and this had happened in the
Mm,
Abbasid world as well, and it would happen with the Fatimids also.
mm,
Al-Hakam II realized he really didn't have to do much governing because the bureaucracy was so well set up that it could kind of run itself.
mm,
And he became something of a figurehead, right? But what happened? Once he became a figurehead, elements within that bureaucracy and the army saw an opportunity for them to take power,
mm,
right? The sort of secret to the success of Abd al-Rahman III was, well, it's like the Habsburgs. What was their motto? Divide and rule, right?
yeah.
So the Caliphate of Al-Andalus was a highly divided place into different factions and groups that Abd al-Rahman III very skillfully balanced against each other to ensure that no one group was powerful enough to challenge him. This is part of the reason why he was so tolerant to Christians and Jews. as a minority, they were really valuable to him because he could use them to govern, but they could never challenge him because they weren't Muslim. So this is going back to tolerance. This is part of the reason for that tolerance.
Yeah.
But in any case, it was this system that was rife with tension, and it was tension that Abd al Rahman could manage. His son Al-Hakam II couldn't. He took his hands off the levers of government, and that unleashed a power struggle within the government in which one individual happened to come out on top. His name was Muhammad ibn Abi Amr. And
And
he,
if I may, for 1 second,
uh,
wanted to add that, it's interesting that every time you seem to have a great ruler that, do great things for the country or empire, there's always this successor who seems to be this idiot or, this, the guy that, tears everything that your father or, the successor done to tear it apart. It's almost like an unwritten rule in history. Every time you have a great ruler, the successor is almost doomed to fail because he has again, he also has such expectation to live up to, but also he feels like sometimes he's just lazy or sometimes, he doesn't need to do much because, your father did all the hard work, so you can just relax and do whatever you want.
well, Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Moroccan scholar who is regarded as the father of the grandfather of sociology and of political science, said that these things happen across 3 generations.
Yeah.
The first generation is hungry and ruthless. The second generation grows up in luxury, but it still manages to hold things together. And the third generation is a generation of spoiled brats who don't know how to do anything.
And it's
And that's
true
what, well, perhaps. But
most of the time.
certainly, what happened was that there was an opportunity, and this opportunity was capitalized on by this individual, Muhammad ibn Abi Amr, who was a member of the sort of bureaucracy, a brilliant, ruthless Machiavellian, and he managed to, through a long sort of process of manipulation and violence, to eliminate the other potential powerful people within the administration. And he positioned himself as essentially the protector of the new caliph. So this individual who we know commonly as Al-Mansur, which became his throne name. Al-Mansur means victorious by God. And he gave himself that name not because of the many campaigns he carried out against Christians. He gave himself that name when he defeated his last Muslim rival within this internal power struggle. And what Muhammad ibn Abi Amr did was he became essentially the dictator of Al-Andalus, ruling under the shadow of the caliph. By this time, the caliph was Al-Hakam's son, Hisham, who was essentially kept a prisoner, a captive figurehead, and a facade for Al-Mansur's power. The problem was that in this volatile environment of the Caliphate of Cordoba, with all of these competing factions, the one thing that held it together was the idea that there was a caliph. So Al-Mansur came to power in the late 900s. Al-Andalus still seemed to be an incredibly strong and powerful empire, maybe even stronger than before. And Al-Mansur really went to great lengths to show that strength. All right. Instead of ruling through soft power like Abd al Rahman III did, Al-Mansur went on the attack deliberately to sow terror among the surrounding principalities, whether they were Christian or Muslim. So he became kind of a strong man, right? Now, when he died and his son came to power, his son made a crucial mistake. His son thought the only way to continue in power was for himself to be named as caliph. And when his son, the son of Al-Mansur, tried to engineer that the succession of the caliphate would pass from the Umayyad family to him, that was something that the people of Al-Andalus, all of the different factions agreed on was not going to happen. and Al-Andalus suddenly exploded into a multifaceted civil war.
Mm. So with the fall of the Caliph, of course, what would the Al-Andalus would fall into disarray, and like we talked again a lot of times in this episode about the illusion of unity, and so you know what happened when the illusion of unity kind of disappears, and you know you have no ruler and no one to claim the title to Caliph anymore. What happens to Al-Andalus then?
Well, it was interesting what happened because, there was a real need for uh, in people's minds that there should be a caliph. The caliph was like kind of the central political idea. It's kind of like it's kind of like the Constitution in the United States, right?
Mm,
Even though, people may ignore the Constitution, they may not know what the Constitution says, and so on and so forth. But the fact that there is a Constitution, the idea of the Constitution is extremely important to hold the country
mm,
together. And this had been the case in Al-Andalus. So when Al-Mansur's son kind of challenges that idea, Al-Andalus, as I said, all of these tensions are now unleashed. There's this massive civil war, and all of a sudden Al-Andalus breaks up into, at first, about 20 separate little kingdoms, right? Now, what the interesting thing is that none of the rulers of these little kingdoms called themselves caliph because they knew they couldn't be caliph because they weren't members of the Umayyad family. You had to be part of the Umayyad
mm,
family, right? And so instead, what they did was they pretended there was still a caliph and that they were just that caliph's prime minister. So the idea of the unity was so important, it even outlived the caliphal family. At that point, history intervened. The balance of power had changed and disunited and fighting amongst each other. These kingdoms in Al-Andalus were now weak. And that provided an opportunity, on the one hand, for Christians from the north to start taking power over
mm.
them, and from Muslim Berbers from the south to start taking over them. So, really, in a way, the fall of the caliphate was the end of an independent Al Andalus.
Mm. Now, let's talk about what would eventually become the Reconquista, and I believe from a little place called Aragon that these these Christians would eventually take over Islamic Spain and the fall of Islamic Spain. And how long did this process take really? And we talked about again, and now I'm repeating a little bit, but we talked about how quickly the Berbers and the Umayyads conquered Spain in the early seventh or eighth centuries. So how quickly did it go for the Christians when it was their turn to? And I'm hesitant in using it, but because it wasn't really a reconquest in the way that they call it a reconquest, but because that, for lack of better words, let's call it a reconquest. So that's how the long time did this so-called reconquest go on for.
Well, absolutely. And you're right to call it a so-called reconquest. I mean, if one pulls back from history, one can say that, between say the year 1100 or, more or less 1100 and 1500, Christians conquered Islamic Spain. And that in itself is true, right? But that is deceptive because it doesn't really tell you what the process was. And the process took a long time. It took essentially 400 years. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One reason was that even though some people at the time certainly did conceive of it as a reconquest, right? It was not a reconquest that was carried out by a unified Christian front against a unified Muslim front. Between the year 1000 and 1500, Spain was a collection of different Muslim kingdoms and different Christian kingdoms, and they were all fighting with each other. Now, ironically, even though Christians and Muslims should, quote unquote, hate each other, right? What we find is that the greatest competition in some ways took place among the Christian kingdoms to see who would be the top Christian kingdom, and among the Muslim kingdoms to see who would be the top Muslim kingdom.
Hmm.
What that meant was that Muslim and Christian kings often allied with one another against other coalitions of Muslims and Christians. So, this process of conquest, in some senses, is a Christian versus Muslim process, but in many senses, it's just a local political contest, a series of local political contests.
Hmm.
And the Christians, to the extent that they conceived of themselves as conquering all of Islamic Spain, were unable to do it quickly because Islamic Spain was so populated and powerful. That meant that they couldn't come in and take over without doing the same thing that the Arabs did when they took over, which was incorporate the Muslims that were there into their political and economic structure. So it was a gradual process, and it could only happen after the two major Christian kingdoms in Spain became united through marriage. At that point, there was finally a kind of united Christian front, and there was only one Muslim kingdom left, so it was a united Muslim front. And this is what kind of brought about the conquest of Granada and the end, as it were, of Islamic Spain.
And we have to, of course, talk about the infamous Ferdinand and Isabella and what I would call the final conquest of Spain. And of course, we have to discuss as well what would they would add to the famous Spanish Inquisition, which you very much could expect. Then the famous Monty Python jokes that I bet you did not expect the Spanish Inquisition, but in reality, you should very much expect the Spanish Inquisition.
Well, there's a lot of misconceptions about the Spanish Inquisition, and one of them was that in principle it was a weapon or a strategy to use against Muslims and Jews. But the fact is, it couldn't be because the Spanish Inquisition, the Inquisition, was only, technically speaking, and in practice, all but exclusively, an institution which was directed at Christians. The church
Mm.
had no power over Muslims or Jews. So the Spanish Inquisition was set up as a consequence of Jews and later Muslims converting to Christianity. And the Inquisition was to ensure that they had really converted and that they were not secretly practicing Judaism or Islam after their conversion. So we have to carve off the Inquisition a little bit from
Yeah.
whatever was going on between Christians and Muslims and Jews, because it was really in principle, it was an internal Christian phenomenon, not an anti-Jewish
Mm.
or an anti-Muslim phenomenon.
Mm. So let's talk about what would happen to both Jews and Muslims under Ferdinand and Isabella, and unlike the Umayyad Spain and the Islamic Spain, and and Andalus in general, it's they were where they were allowed Christians and Jews were mostly allowed to practice their faiths in peace. This was not necessarily the same case under Ferdinand and Isabella, especially for the Jews and, of course, the Muslims as well, but especially for the Jews, perhaps.
Yeah, well, this is where, this is one of the areas in which that whole notion of tolerance or toleration
Hmm.
as a historical paradigm breaks down. Because you can say that Ferdinand and Isabella were not tolerant, right?
Yeah.
Because, obviously the Jews were kicked out in 1492, and Muslims came under some pressure. But the problem with that is it kind of groups them together. And what happened with the Jews and what happened with the Muslims were really two separate things. Essentially, two things happened to the Jews of Spain, to put it in very kind of rough, to frame it very roughly. First of all, they had kind of outlived their usefulness in a way. You know, in the Middle Ages, Christian kings and even bishops and the church cultivated having Jewish communities within their
Hmm.
kingdoms for certain reasons, largely economic. Jewish communities provided certain economic benefits to
And this,
kings.
of course, would be of course, the rise of the Rothschilds, for one.
Well, no, we're way before the Rothschilds,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
this is
no,
a
I'm just
separate
using an example that this is how the
possibly,
Rothschilds came to
possibly.
power.
But the point is that Christian law, in theory, did not allow Christians to lend each other money at
Mm.
interest. You can't have an economy that doesn't have credit. So Jews took up this role within Christian society. Okay, they became moneylenders, among many other things, right? However, by the time we get to the 15th century, Christians had normalized money lending. Therefore, Jews were not as important to them. Secondly, there was a deep antagonism between the church and Judaism. The survival of Judaism was a poke in the eye to the church. Jesus, of course, had been a Jew, right? He lived among Jews, and the fact that not all Jews recognized him as the Son of God or the Messiah, right, was something that the church found, let's say, annoying, right? So there was a sort of built-in antagonism towards Jews within the Christian church, right? So that's the second reason, right? The third reason is that thanks to that antagonism, since the late 13th century, Jews had become under increasing pressure in Spain and subject to occasional bouts of popular and official violence. As a consequence, many Jews had converted to Christianity. Now, two things happened when those Jews converted to Christianity. Many of them converted out of fear, and therefore perhaps they were not genuine converts. The other thing that happened was that when high status Jews converted to Christianity, they immediately moved into the higher echelons of the Christian world. And some Christians didn't like that because they thought these people are Jews. They shouldn't be members of the elite like we are. So there were all these tensions that were sort of culminating. By the time we get to the 15th century, it becomes clear to Isabel the Catholic that she has a problem. Isabel the Catholic didn't necessarily not like Jews. Just like Donald Trump today has many black friends, Isabel had many Jewish friends, right? But the point was, she was concerned that the fact that there were many Jewish converts in her kingdom that might not be fully converted to Christianity, and that there were still Jewish subjects in her kingdom, that meant that there was a potential that these Jews might convert back from Christianity to Judaism. And that's something that, on a religious level, you wouldn't want to do. That's failing your people by allowing them to reconvert to the wrong
Yeah.
religion. So, for Isabel, the solution to that was to expel the remaining Jews from Spain. They did not accept Christianity. The Muslims didn't come under any such pressure under the Catholic kings until after 1500. And then only in Castile. Muslims continued to be allowed to practice their faith in the realms of Aragon until 1526. So there were two entirely different situations because their economic role and their political role was different. Muslims were not engaged in the credit market and did not become irrelevant. Muslims provided crucial manpower in agricultural and artisanal sectors. And therefore, it was impractical and it was counter-effective to repress or expel Muslims. So we're talking about two separate cases. The Jews came under this very intense pressure, this intolerance, whereas the Muslims largely did not.
Mm. So what was the difference between, and I know you kind of, why did the Muslims not fall under the same pressure as the Jews for, the same reasons?
How do you mean?
You said Muslims had it somewhat easier than the Jews. They had less pressure. But okay, never mind. But I think we're gonna round it up there actually. And I have one last question actually before we go. And I know you want to talk about this as well because you said there are some similarities what happening in the United States today to Al-Andalus, and what are those similarities that you see happening between Al-Andalus and, United States today?
Well, I think that there are, and one always has to be careful when one draws parallels between the past and the present.
Mm,
History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but certainly we can observe similar patterns. And lately, in the last weeks, I've been teaching in one of my classes the fall of the Caliphate of Cordoba. And it seems to me that there are certain parallels that we can see. For example, the Caliphate of Cordoba was a highly polarized and diverse society, which was held together through the strength of a central idea, right? In this case, it was the idea of the caliph. In the case of the United States now, it's the idea of the Constitution, right? When that central power, for whatever reason, became weaker or confidence was lost in it, these various tensions within the empire, within the caliphate, were no longer held in check. And that provided an opportunity for elements within the power structure to attempt to take over and to dispense with that essential unity that had held together the
mm,
caliphate. When that happened, it was essentially the end of caliphal power and the end of Al-Andalus.
mm,
Because in order to obtain the sort of power that he wanted, Al-Mansur and his family found themselves in a position where they had to challenge that central idea of the caliphate, which was the
mm.
Umayyad Caliph.
I can,
And this
yeah.
is one of the things that contributed to the sudden and quite dramatic collapse of Al-Andalus.
Mm. And you can also see kind of with, especially with the expulsion of Jews in Al-Andalus, you can see as also with ICE being portrayed, being out in the streets of United States cities and villages, etc. You can see kind of similarities there as well with this time they targeted immigrants, so you can also see kind of similarities with the Jewish expulsion in Spain and what ICE is now doing to the immigrants that come into.
Possibly,
I'm not, yeah.
possibly. One doesn't want to take these
No,
comparisons,
of
too
course.
far, but one can see patterns in history that resemble each other.
Mm,
And it seems to me that in some ways we've been here before. So it's
yeah,
instructive to look at what happened in other places and other
yeah.
times.
And I think we're gonna round it up there. I know we're a little bit out of time for what you preferred, but thank you again so much for being so patient this episode. This has been a great pleasure. You're always welcome back to the podcast if
Oh,
you wish to. Well, I know we only touched the tip of the iceberg, and of course, before we got to the promotion, we made an episode on Al Andalus as well a few years ago with Ross Brand. It is episode 101. I highly recommend looking at that as well. And of course, if you wish to, well, read more. You should absolutely read the book that Trent Oliver paired Kingdom of Faith, A New
thank you.
History of Islamic Spain. And where can people find the book if they want? Because we only touch the tip of the iceberg in what we have time for today. So where can people buy or read your book if they wish to learn more about what we talked about today?
Well, they can get it in their from their favorite online vendor, and they can read it in Spanish, in German, in Polish, in Korean, in Chinese. It's out in a number of languages, so there's no excuse not to read it, I guess.
And if people have further questions about what we talked about today, and if people are you on social media you want to share, or if people have questions that they perhaps want to ask you, where do people find you if you want to be found?
Well, anyone is welcome to email me, and it's easy to find on Google. I don't do social media, so I'm
You're
afraid
not missing out.
it's not an option.
Thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great pleasure. This has been One That Aged Well. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Spotify, consider give us 5 stars. That would be very nice. If you're on Apple Podcasts, consider write a review and also give us 5 stars. If you're on YouTube, I miss those days when you could give 5 stars on YouTube, but give a like and leave a comment. And of course, like, share, and subscribe wherever, whichever platform you use. We are available on social media under that aged well on Twitter and Instagram. I refuse to call it X for whatever reason Elon decided to change it into. I still call it Twitter. This has been that aged well. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.